women continue to face significant challenges in the workplace despite progress in recent decades, positioning them as second-class citizens in the professional sphere. The gender pay wage gap persists, with women globally earning a mere 51 cents for every dollar earned by men. The discrepancy is exacerbated by intersections with race, class, and ability. Today, for this discussion, we are joined by Vuyisa Mamanzi, Dr. Christi Kruger, and Abigail Komu in order to unpack the position of women in the workplace. And this panel is moderated by me, Nwabisa Mazana. I would like to take this moment to welcome our panelists and the audience joining us today. As stated, my name is Nwabisa Mazana. I am the marketing specialist at Digital Frontiers, and I'd like to just take a moment to greet my great panelists that have joined me today and also give them a moment to introduce themselves and let us know a bit more about what they do. I'll start with you, Vuyisa.
Thank you so much, Nwabisa, and thank you to Digital Frontiers for inviting us to be part of this panel discussion. I am super excited to join my fellow panelists and to be engaging with the audience. As Nwabisa has said, my name is Vuyisa Mamanzi. I work at the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender based at the University of Pretoria. I am a researcher at the center as well as a project manager. My background is in anthropology, and I am a self-appointed troublemaker when it comes to gender issues. Thank you so much, Nwabisa.
Thank you so much for your perfect introduction, and we love troublemakers over here. I'll move over to Dr. Christi for a quick introduction from your side.
Thank you so much. And for those in the audience who may have seen my colleague Pierre's photo in the advert, no, Pierre did not grow hair, and Benjamin Button himself, he's in fact not well this morning, so asked that I represent on his behalf. So we often joke that we speak for one another, and in this case it's going to be very true because I have some of his notes and some of my own thoughts. But in any way, good afternoon from a very cold South Africa to those of you who might be based elsewhere. My name is Christi Kruger, and I work with Vuyisa at the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, where I'm the Senior Manager for Research. And I'm also a subject matter expert in DFI's Gender Changemakers program. And so I look forward to some of the engagements and hopefully some interaction with the audience later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christi, for your introduction. I'll move on to you, Abigail.
Thank you, Nwabisa, and thank you, everyone. My name is Abigail Komu, and I am privileged to be among gender equality change makers. I have been a student at DFI for the longest time. I don't know if I want to count the years, but more recently in the Gender Equality Change Makers course, which has really opened my eyes to the issues of gender when it comes to different facets of life. And so I am privileged to be joined by Christi as well as Vuyisa, who I was in their class to be, and I was in their class. And so I really enjoyed it, and I hope many of us get the opportunity to actually do it. Separately, I am also a digital finance practitioner. I do a lot of consultancy work in the areas of digitizing financial services, and I am happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion with the panelists as well as the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to amazing panelists for making the time and the audience for joining us. And I think with such an important something discussion that speaks to the times that we're in, I'd like for us to, before we delve into the depths of our discussion, to spend a bit of time just unpacking the history of women in the workplace, specifically within the regions that we find ourselves in, and a focus on what does the history look like? And if you guys would just like to spend a minute unpacking that with me, I'd like to just maybe ask Dr. Christi to go first, maybe speaking about the history of women overall within the workplace and even in South Africa.
Well, I'm glad that you're not starting with a difficult question. So that's a very broad question, and it can be answered in several different ways, because of course, when we say history, we have to ask which history. And also, I think really importantly here, the question is, what is work? Because women have always been working. But I think for the benefit of our discussion today, we are talking about working outside of the home, right? We're talking about paid work. And if we look at that, I think we cannot speak about women and work in South Africa, but also in the region, without reflecting on the ways in which gender has intersected with race and colonialism. And this has been a very big issue. So historically, we know that when we think about pre-colonial times, we do know that in many African societies, there's been instances where women have had different forms of power. In some places, women were seen as inferior and did not have access to the same things. But in some places, women were seen as equals, could access land, etc., and therefore establish themselves as kind of on an equal footing. However, I think if we focus on kind of just the 20th century, what we've seen is that for Black women especially, things look pretty bleak. For the longest time, women were seen as I guess in the most simplest terms, was seen as not very different from children. So women did not have the right in many spaces to own their own land. A woman could not own a bank account, oftentimes without a husband or a father or a brother's permission. And so really women started entering the workplace in many instances only sort of by the mid 20th century, right? Before that, a woman's role was in the home. She had children. The husband had to work and bring in money, and it was kind of unfathomable for a woman to be anything else. As things started to change, there were certain careers that were seen as okay for women to follow. So a woman could be a teacher or a nurse, for example. But if we're being honest, I think even though that has changed, what we see is that in almost all spaces across the board, women can now technically, in terms of policy and law, access most spaces. But in terms of salaries, for example, there's still a huge discrepancy between what women earn and what men earn. And in many spheres of society, women are still seen as out of place. For example, if we think about something like, ironically, finance or engineering, it's not seen as a woman's place. And sadly, in many instances, that has not changed. So we're not only talking about history, but also about the present day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Christi. And I think I'd like to bring you in a bit more here on Vuyisa to speak about, the inferiority of how women are classed within workspaces, that even in the present, it's still a big issue that we have to grapple with, the part where you're still understood as this is not a woman's place. There's jobs that are understood as spaces where women cannot occupy. And I'd like for you to just take us through a bit of that through, the lens of even gender at work and those frameworks that are used in those tools. So over to you, Vuyisa.
Thank you so much, Nwabisa. I really like how Christi started off, by highlighting and asking the critical question of, so what is work? And here we are talking about paid work. It's not by accident that we find ourselves in the current position where women are still second-class citizens in the workplace. And I think Christi touched on some of these issues that a precedent was set that some bodies had the right to enjoy certain privileges more than others, meaning that it was the men who had authority in society and women were seen as subordinate to them. And before I talk about the gender at work framework, I would also like to highlight that beginning as early as in the 1920s, women of all racial groups slowly began to gravitate to towns. And this in South Africa was the result of the rise of the industrial economy, the growth of towns, and the development of the migrant labor system, which meant that things needed to change. Hence, we saw women gravitating to towns and were drawn into the labor market. In 1978, a survey reviewing the pay of female South African workers was published in the Black Sash, an influential South African magazine. And looking back, it exposed horrifying truths. It also discussed employment statistics, wages, and discrimination between Black and white men and women, training schemes, promotion, benefits, education, pregnancy, trade unions, things such as sexual exploitation and worker representation. The shocking results of the survey also showed in statistical numbers how little Black women were being paid in factories in comparison to other lines of work, other races, and males. The women had no pension or provident fund, and were subject to termination if they became pregnant. I could go on, Nwabisa, and then touch on the gender at work framework, if you like, or maybe I could hold it there for now, and maybe when I respond to a follow-up question, and then I'll speak in depth around the gender at work framework.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think we'll go into a bit of more depth when you present a bit more of the framework. But thank you now, I think, for giving a big overview of, the historical parts and giving that context. And I'd like to also move on to Abigail. And I think within us unpacking the history of women within the workplace and what this has looked like regionally. I think for you, Abigail, this might also give context even to the present, that I'd like to just give you a bit of a moment to also just give any reflection that you might have within the historical concept of women within the workplace.
Thanks, Nwabisa. And so I'd like to agree with my fellow panelists that, traditionally women were confined to the domestic sphere. And so you find that they were responsible for raising children and caring for the home. And to some extent, you do find that these have actually been carried over to the workplace in terms of expectations. And, that manifests itself in different ways. It could be in terms of the jobs that are reserved mostly, or we find that women have been hired for. And then similarly, similar to what Christi said, there are some such as engineering, finance, technology, etc., that are often seen as a reserve for men. And oftentimes when you talk about maybe that fact that we have progressed, that is sometimes the case, but we still find our people in the rural setting still have not gotten over that, and some of those roles are still confined in that space. So yes, so I just wanted to add that there are those two things that we need to really think about. In as much as we are moving forward, there are some people that we're leaving behind, and And a lot of the work that is traditionally we call unpaid care work often translates back into the workplace in different ways, either formally or informally, in terms of the roles that women find themselves doing.
Thank you so much for that honest reflection on that, Abigail. And I think now that we've unpacked a lot of the history and how we've found ourselves within the spaces where, the past keeps on representing itself even in the current, because of the issues of the fact that often with systematic issues, it's not as easy as often implementing small changes. And I think within that space, now we can offer a bit of reflection with women in the workplace, but currently. And I'd like for us to spend a bit of time maybe unpacking when we speak about often overlooked challenges. And I think of how a paper had been written about, the invisible hands of women within spaces and places like Marikana, and how often women contribute to labor in ways that's not accounted for. Or often women, their issues within labor spaces aren't seen, often acknowledged, because it often does not look and present itself in certain ways within like how they would maybe in how men present themselves within the labor force. And I'd like for us to spend a bit of time maybe speaking about what is often seen as overlooked challenges. And I use these, colons and these brackets to say overlooked, because within spaces where women, we share these spaces, we're able to acknowledge that, of course, you have an issue like that within the workplace because we're often experiencing them. But within the workspace in itself as a broader, space, these are often overlooked because our problems often are bared by us and brands by us that are often quiet and not said, because it's seen as like difficulties that are more within that's why women maybe can't be in these spaces or can't occupy certain spaces such as these. So I'd like for us to maybe speak about these often overlooked challenges and maybe spend a bit of time reflecting on this. And I'd also like to link this to your gender at work framework and the analysis to that. And maybe you can take a bit of time reflecting on this and how this tool can be used to analyze these type of issues and used as a tool to overcome them.
Thank you, Nwabisa. Through our experiences facilitating the class calls and engaging with our students in the GEC program, what has come up a lot in terms of some of the challenges and overlooked problems within the workplace or in the organizations, or issues around sexual harassment, issues around transparency when it comes to the gender wage gap. Salaries are still a secret. There's not much transparency there, and oftentimes you do get people who are doing the same job but not being paid equally. So these are some of the overlooked challenges that most women are still experiencing within their organization. And when we look at the gender at work framework, how does it really help us dismantle some of these issues? How does it help us uncover some of these power dynamics that keep some of these exclusionary, discriminatory practices in place? So I would like to start off by answering maybe this question. So what is the framework and how can we use it? The framework really highlights the different domains of change, where change needs to happen for gender equality to be achieved. So the gender at work analytical framework also helps change agents to really uncover and challenge deep structures of inequality and discriminatory social norms. These can be formal and informal barriers to gender equality. Now, if we look at the diagram, the right-hand side of the framework deals with the formal aspects of change and looks at the things that are measurable. These are things that we can see and touch. These are changes both at the individual level as well as at the systemic level. Now, if we look at resources at the individual level, this have to do with access to services. For example, making resources available to do policy reviews, ensuring that these policies are implemented. For example, as well as setting up a gender unit within an organization and setting up trustworthy reporting structures. All of these things need resources. The lower right-hand side of the quadrant on the formal side of the framework looks at laws and policies. These rules and policies that look and address issues concerning the gender pay gap, sexual harassment, parental and maternity leave concerns, or any other concerns that may exist within an organization. So these rules and policies also determine, who has access to resources in terms of who is eligible to receive what and gain. And again, these are clear. These are things that we can see and measure. Now, when we move on to the informal domain, this is the left-hand side of the framework. On the informal side of the framework, we look at things that are not necessarily obvious. These can't be seen and are really very difficult to measure. So at the top left-hand quadrant, here we look at people's consciousness, we look at people's awareness and capabilities, as well as their leadership abilities. And importantly, change needs to happen in this quadrant for gender equality to happen. Quadrant 4, which is the lower left-hand quadrant, is about social norms and deep structure. These are social norms, values, and practices that are often unnoticed because they are deeply rooted and taken for granted, as well as seen as normal. It is important to remember that more often than not, social norms and practices prescribe gender roles, prohibit women from exercising their rights, and limit interventions for change. Oftentimes, resistance to transformative work will stem from this particular quadrant, because work in this quadrant challenges and dismantles that which is deeply rooted, taken for granted, and seen as normal. Hence, work in this particular quadrant is very important. And once change happens in this particular quadrant, it also influences change in all of the other quadrants. And I think for now, I will leave it there, Nwabisa.
Thank you so much for that, and I think being able to obviously have tools such as this as a way to analyze gender in the workforce offers us great insight. And I'd like to invite Dr. Christi to maybe unpack a bit further and spend a bit of time with us reflecting on this issue of what is often understood as overlooked challenges, and challenges that aren't, often incorporated into even work policies or any type of labor laws, and often require a bit of more, lobbying and a bit of more work within certain groups where people have to have a bit of more advocacy for the laws to often take place. And like for you, Dr. Christi, maybe to offer us a bit of insight into what is even understood as often overlooked and how this presents itself within different workspaces.
Thanks very much. I think this is very useful following on Vuyisa, because I think she's laid out very well how these challenges occur in different domains, right? So there are those overlooked challenges that are formal, and there are those that we can say are informal, right? So I'd like to start by saying that those of you who've done the GEC course will know that we often say that the formal ones are maybe a bit easier to advocate for, to tackle. Because these are the things that are in writing. There's a set of rules. So if we think, for example, around sexual harassment policy, something that's been in conversation a lot over the last couple of years, it's kind of a tangible thing that you can go to and you can see, is there a sexual harassment policy in an organization? And if there isn't, you can lobby to have one. However, for me, this is sort of my personal opinion, I think the challenges that are harder to overcome are often those that lie in the informal. So those ones where the rules aren't written down anywhere, but you have to decode it. I'm not sure how much time we have, so I'm not going to go into the detail because I don't want to take up all the time. But I think, when I spoke to Pierre about what he wanted to sort of talk about and his thinking, he mentioned that to me some research around the COVID-19 pandemic and what happened there, right? And so I think that was a really good example of some of the challenges that are informal and that are difficult to kind of tackle because it's harder to point out, right? So you'll see there on your screens, those of you who sort of want to read through that. To save time, I'm not going to focus on every one of those bullets, but in short, I think what many of us who are women who live in female bodies realized during this time is that all of a sudden, when a lot of people had to work from home, especially.
Oh, I think we've lost Dr. Christi there. Probably because of network. Okay, we'll just move along, and then when Dr. Christi comes back online, they'll offer a bit more insight. But I think while we're speaking about this and, COVID and the workplace and unprecedented times that we live in, I'd like to invite you, Abigail, to just give a bit of reflection on the issue of, often overlooked challenges in the workplace and any type of personal reflection that you might be able to offer on these points of, dealing with things that are changing consistently and being a woman in the workforce, and how often the challenges that you face might be not accounted for, or things that you might need to advocate for, in a bit more.
Thanks, Nwabisa. So I agree that oftentimes, and you'll find so I also facilitate the gender equality change makers community of practice here in Kenya. And oftentimes, when you talk about the gender action plans and, the capstone projects that the students are going to do, they're more reflective of, the more formal quadrant, bringing in policies, putting in resources and whatnot. But you find that, and especially in some organizations that are not, I would say, multinational or formal, in my experience, I have found that it is the gender stereotypes and the unconscious bias challenges that are there. And so, just to give you an example, I worked some years ago in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and you would find that the local women there would not be able to travel to work or for work in other places, in other regions, in other countries, without being accompanied by a male counterpart. And so, in as much as that is not captured anywhere as a policy, those are more, I would say, social norms and that affect even in how organizations hire, because then if you know that you have that added, I would say, responsibility, it makes it difficult to then say you're going to hire 50% women, because if you're going to hire 50%, then you'll have to hire 50 plus, and especially if it's a traveling role. And so I agree that a lot of them are around social norms, gender stereotypes, and unconscious bias, which is where we need to spend a lot of time really understanding what the overlooked challenges are there. And I'll give another example maybe before I turn it over. I was recently speaking with a small organization. It hires about 20 people. And consciously or unconsciously, the founder basically said the way in which he remunerates his employees is that he'll pay the men better or higher, simply because his view is that they are the ones that are the breadwinners in their homes. But we know that that is not the reality, because there are a lot of single parent homes where women are actually the ones that are raising these children. And so it reinforces the fact that, as much as they'll take care of the family, they'll take care of the homes, even at work, they can't get, a salary that can help them do that in a, I would say, dignified way, because then they have to look for other work, and then take time off. So anyway, it becomes a cycle. And so I strongly believe that really understanding where the issues are and beginning to have those conversations one person at a time to really unpack them is where we'll start to see the changes, whatever it is that we are, whether it is in our homes, in our societies, in the groups that we're in, and as well as work, so that we can begin to drive gender equality in a way that is sustainable and moves faster across board.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Abigail. And we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like for us to just spend a bit of time with some questions from our audience, and being able to just answer those. And what I love is that this particular question is posed to Dr. Christi, on the points that you were speaking about within your gender analysis framework. The question asks that even though the formal issues are easier to advocate for, not tackling the informal ones makes it harder to implement interventions like policies long term. So the person is asking you that, would you say that even though the formal issues are easy to advocate for, not tackling the informal ones makes it harder to implement interventions like policies long term?
Thank you for that question, and I apologize for disappearing. My internet went through a dip, I think. I think that is such a good question. And I think what we have to remember when we think about this kind of schema is that we divide it into these different categories for ourselves to make it easier to think about. But in reality, it's absolutely true that all of these are interwoven, right? And so it's often easier to start with the things like policy review or budget, but it's absolutely true. Yes, if you don't tackle the informal things, people might resist. You might have a culture where you have a policy against workplace discrimination, but people are scared to report because of the informal culture, right? So for me, I think as long as you start somewhere, the others will follow eventually. It might take time, but on the one hand, if you tackle the organizational culture, policy stuff will become easier. If there's a policy that's followed through, if there's budget made available, if appointments are equitable, then inevitably the organizational culture will start changing. So it's a kind of chicken egg, but eventually I think it will get there as long as you just start somewhere.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that answer. And I think as we wrap up our discussion, just one final question that speaks to the future in the workplace. And I'd love for us to be as imaginative as possible, because in the face of any type of oppression, hope often keeps us alive and striving for better. And I'd like to ask the whole panel, how can we ensure a fairness and equality of opportunity and justice for women within the workplace? Basically, how can we dismantle these challenges that are faced by women in the workplace? And if we had to be as imaginative as possible or answer as practically or any way that you could, there's no wrong or right answer. So I just want to open the floor up to our panelists and anyone who'd just like to tackle with this question.
Okay, I think I will go for it. I think I in responding to this question, I would like to start off by saying that we are now recognizing women's participation in their struggle for freedom from oppression, in terms of community rights, and importantly, for gender equality in the workplace and beyond. And I think that acknowledgement and recognition is very important. Also, when we look at annual reports from the Gates Foundation and UN Women, we see that progress has been made towards women's rights and gender equality. And we need to acknowledge that important change is happening in our societies and within our organizations. However, if we are going to have an honest conversation about the plight of women in the workplace, we need to acknowledge as well that most women are still second-class citizens in the workplace. We need to see a shift in the discriminatory values, practices, and social norms. We are still exclusionary. We are still seeing exclusionary practices based on caste, based on class, based on gender, based on race, and other identity markers. So to move forward from where we are now, in terms of shifting and changing structural dimensions of poverty and inequality, we need to look at the ways in which we value people and enable them to participate in leading and shaping transformation within their own organizations, because what people experience, what people live in their daily lives, they are the ones who know how best to change some of those realities. And that is why it is important that we also redefine and relook at how we value people. So I think for now, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Vuyisa. I really do appreciate it. And Abigail, if we had to look at the future quickly, how would you say that we could dismantle the current issues faced by women in the workplace?
So I look at it at three levels. One is, and I think I touched on this earlier, self-introspection, and really trying to uncover, why is it that I think about women in a certain type of way, personally, as well as in the context of where it is that we live and work. Secondly, it's within the organizations in which we work. And so the other day I was hosting a community of practice meeting, and it was just excellent hearing from the students that now when they sit in meetings, they're beginning to reflect on, some of the, policies that they can put in place. They're beginning to advocate and having those conversations, one person at a time. And then I think thirdly, from a policy perspective, so you do find that there's a lot of civic request by governments to actually feed back to some of the policies that they have in place. Like recently, there was one here in Kenya where they wanted people to come and talk about the 2/3 gender rule for women participating in politics and government. And so in such cases, I think we should really lend our voice to say that this is what we think, so that it can be considered even as government is thinking about some of these policies. Because once we have the right people in leadership, once we have the right people in place, then we can begin to see changes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us and our audience. And if you have any questions, you can still ask the questions within DigiCampus on our conversations panel. But other than that, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the summit. And thank you again to our panelists. You should all have a great day.